The match between Oleg Zhokh and Avtandil Tutberidze at East vs West 11 was one of the most interesting ones to me because it got me thinking. Oleg Zhokh is not really that strong. Okay, full disclaimer, I'm in no way saying that Oleg is weak. Obviously he's not. He's a multiple-time national, European, and world champion, and he's not only successful in his own weight class, but he's also dominated athletes far heavier than him. But all that being said, I think there's one key thing that makes him seem way stronger than he actually is that most people might not realize. And no, I'm not talking about his freaky forearm, though that obviously does help. It's actually his thumb. And I'm not even talking about the size or strength of it, it's the actual position of where his thumb is located on his hand. If you look closely, when Oleg fully opens his hand, you'll realize that it opens to a full 90-degree angle between the thumb and the wrist, and that is where the insane advantage lies. There are two things that his thumb position does. It causes his opponent to start the match already practically in a dad move. This is where the fingers of the opponent are holding on to his wrist, or at least really far down his hand, rather than being able to get a high grip. This causes a huge mechanical disadvantage to the opponent just because of the physics of levers. The lower down you are on your opponent's hand or arm, the greater the amount of force they would be able to exert on you. Just moving an inch lower on your opponent's arm can mean an additional 5% force, which would be required to match the same amount of effort. And just to demonstrate to you guys what I mean, I have a handy dandy little lever calculator over here. So, just to imagine what this looks like on an arm, the fulcrum over here, you can imagine it as my elbow, and F over there is the force that my elbow flexes, so my bicep brachialis, brachioradialis pulling over here, and W would be the opponent's force pushing my hand and arm down. So if you can imagine that, F is here, W here, the opponent. So, just for argument's sake, I'm just gonna put a 50 kilogram force that my opponent is pushing down on my hand with. And the known distance, L1, which is the length of my arm, I'm just gonna put it as, roughly 50 centimeters from elbow to, my hand. Roughly 50 centimeters. And L2, I don't know exactly where the elbow flexors, attach. I'm just gonna say halfway down my forearm, I guess. I don't know, so I'm just gonna put 25 centimeters and we'll get some number over here. So force required for my elbow flexors to resist a 50 kilogram force over here is 100 kilograms. So 100 kilograms required by myself to resist 50 kilograms over here. Just by changing the distance L1. So instead of 50 centimeters, I'm just gonna reduce it by an inch or 2.5 centimeters. So I'm just gonna go down. So that's supposed to represent the opponent sliding down my hand by just 2.5 centimeters or an inch. So I'm gonna put in 47.5 centimeters for L1 right now. I would expect a roughly 5% decrease in effort needed by myself to hold that same 50 kilo force. And calculate, and you can see right here the force required 95 kilograms. So exactly 5% just for these arbitrary numbers that we pulled in. So of course, in actuality, the numbers will change a little bit here and there, but this is a rough ballpark estimate that you can sort of safely assume. And when you're working at close to 100% effort like you would during a real match, just a 5% difference is enormous. The next thing is that it also allows for both wraps of the strap to fall below his wrist line. This is impossible for anyone with a normal hand. But because of the abnormal build of Oleg's hand, specifically with regards to the position of his thumb, Oftentimes, the strap that would normally be on the back of an arm wrestler's hand ends up on his wrist instead. And to demonstrate to you just how ridiculous this is, remember the 64 kilo back pressure lift that I did in the previous video? Well, this is the same weight, but with the top wrap on my wrist instead. So it's the exact same 64 kilos, just that I'm gonna put the wrap around my wrist instead, the top wrap on my wrist. So instead of going through the hand, it's going through the wrist here. Okay. Much easier. See the difference? Now combining these two advantages here alone, Oleg is already at a 10 to 15% advantage over his opponent, even before we consider anything else. And that brings me to a more ethical and philosophical discussion surrounding the arm wrestling rules. Should abnormalities like this be allowed? I think this case is something to seriously consider because it is not something like other genetic advantages where it just benefits that puller alone, but it also greatly changes the fundamental aspects of the arm wrestling game and directly affects the opponent. Oleg is able to pull with a completely different strap setup, and his opponents are forced to pull with a completely different grip. Imagine an arm wrestling match where you are forced to start by holding onto your opponent's wrist, and you are strapped from your hand to their forearm. I know this is a slippery slope that I'm going down, and by no means am I convinced fully on my opinions about this, but as it stands right now, I'm finding it hard to see how this should be allowed. That is why I think this is something important to discuss, which is why I'm throwing the question out to hear you guys' opinions as well. What do you think about Oleg's advantages, as well as more generally speaking, physical advantages that directly affect the opponent and changes the game fundamentally? For example, can you imagine an opponent with a huge tumor or a growth on the back of their hand which prevents their opponent from even closing their hand? Should someone like that be allowed to pull? Let me know your thoughts in the comment section below. Remember to keep things civil and be respectful. I'm Greg, and I'll see you beasts in the next one.